Good morning, Agnes.
Good morning, Frank. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know how busy you must be, so it's much appreciated. I obviously wanted to talk to you about this groundbreaking report that Amnesty International released yesterday, I think,
Yes.
Thursday, December 5th,
Yes.
which came to the conclusion that Israel's war in Gaza amounted to genocide. I'm
Yes.
sure you are aware that this is a very charged word and that many people have refused to use it when it comes to Israel's action in Gaza. Because we know that legally the threshold for genocide is very, very high,
Yeah.
and that to prove genocide, you have to prove intent. And
Yeah.
that's why it's so hard to prove. But I was wondering then, your report is nearly 300 pages long. How did you come to this conclusion?
Thank you very much, Frank. The conclusion is based on months of research. It brings together 14 months of investigation into individual crimes. It became very clear to us at some point that telling the story of each of those crimes was not enough, and that we needed to look at them holistically, to look at those crimes one after the other, but in a much more integrated way, because that story is different from the individual crime story. And that story is much more scary, is much more serious and grave. Each of those crimes, when you look at them in throughout the last 14 months, have been repeated. They have cumulative effect. Their impact are integrated. And the conclusion that emerged from that full picture is that Israel has committed the crime of genocide, and in particular, that it has perpetrated 3 acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention: killings, causing bodily harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza. We have also, as you pointed out, demonstrated that the evidence we gathered could only lead to one reasonable conclusion, which is that Israel intended to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. And yes, it is complicated because we are in the middle of an armed conflict, and Israel, of course, has military objectives. But the military objectives, including that of getting rid of Hamas, should not cloud our thinking and our analysis. And when we considered the evidence that we gathered, it emerged very clearly that this evidence could not be explained by the military objectives and could only be explained by genocidal intent. And this is why we have reached the conclusion that Israel has committed and is committing the crime of genocide against Palestinian people in Gaza.
It's interesting because you've just said has committed and is committing, because if I'm correct, all your research and the findings of the report stop at around, is it July?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of the evidence were collected from October to July. However, as we explain in the report, we continued to interview people, we continued to gather the evidence, and what we have shown in the report is that what happened after July either continued the patterns identified before July or even in sometimes accelerated those patterns, as is clearly the case right now in northern Gaza. So that is why we are insisting that the genocide is ongoing. It did not stop, it is ongoing. And that is why also we're publishing this report with such a sense of urgency, demanding of the international community that they took far more resolute action to put an end to it.
So yeah, as you were saying, I guess the report was about putting the dots together, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly the right way of putting it. For the last 14 months, Amnesty International has published many briefings or reports related to individual investigation. We've investigated direct attacks on civilians. We investigated indiscriminate attacks on civilians. We investigated disproportionate attacks on civilians. We investigated the collective punishment of Palestinians. We've investigated wanton destruction of Palestinians. But when you put all of those investigations together, then it becomes clear that the military objectives cannot explain what's going on. Let me give you some examples, because we really need, I think, the clear message we want to give is that there is genocidal intent. And we prove it by looking at the pattern of conduct for the last 24 months. For instance, I'm mentioning direct attacks on civilians. We have plenty of evidence demonstrating that civilians' home, Palestinians' home have been destroyed, Palestinian lives killed without any kind of Hamas presence or military necessity. This kind of deliberate targeting of civilians have been repeated for the last 14 months. We have documented the use of very large weapons, very large bombs with huge destruction radius. Again, these kind of bombs in an urban setting can only have one particular objective, which is to inflict the greatest number of casualties on civilians. And, you know, it's particularly the case because those attacks are happening at night when they are likely to get the greatest number of people. We have documented the destruction of farming land. Farming lands, there is no military objective there. Hamas is not hiding on farming land. It is really part and parcel of an attempt to destroy any kind of future or conditions of life upon which the Palestinians can survive. We have documented the destruction of all the bakeries, destruction of all the water infrastructures, meaning that currently Palestinians do not have access to drinkable water. None of those acts can be explained by a military objective or military necessity. Indeed, because they amount to the act prohibited under the Genocide Convention, the intention that is emerging is that the Israeli authorities intended and intend to destroy Palestinians in Gaza in whole and in part. And this is further evidenced by the statement, by the declaration made by officials. Those statements consistently, not just immediately after October 7, but consistently have dehumanized Palestinians, have called for genocidal act. And those very statements are then picked up by soldiers on the ground, clearly showing the influence and the impact of those statements on individual behavior of soldiers, who then are videotaping themselves, calling for the destruction of Gaza, calling for the annihilation of Gaza. This is only a snapshot of the evidence that we have collected, but all of it points to the fact that there is genocidal intent. There has been and continue to be genocidal intent.
Yes, and I think what you're saying is very important because, like, we are now, we live in a world where everything is live, everything is you can watch it on your phones, and the thing, it looks so obvious to every sort of normal human being, that from the start, after October the 7th, Israel's intent has been broadcasted live by everyone, you know, generals, politicians, and then, so that's the intent. The intent is someone saying, a general, we are going to cut water, food, electricity to Gaza. And then you see the act of doing it. So the case, even for a non-lawyer person, you know, the case seems quite straightforward. But I think what your report is also saying is that the report makes the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, that war never justifies genocide.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Yeah, because look, some lawyers have argued that under the Genocide Convention and under the interpretation of that convention by the International Court of Justice, there is the notion of reasonable conclusion. Only reasonable conclusion must be that there is a single intent. That is true. The wording of the convention and the ICJ, the International Criminal the Court of Justice, interpretation speaks about only reasonable conclusion. But that does not mean that there is only one intent. It means that the reasonable conclusion that can be extracted from the conclusion, from the finding, is that there is genocidal intent. But it does not mean that there is only one intent. And indeed, for instance, in the former Yugoslavia, when genocide has been found, it was found in the context of an armed conflict, and it was found alongside other military objectives, and indeed other violations such as ethnic cleansing. So there is nothing about the interpretation of the Genocide Convention that suggests that you need to find only one single intent. That there is nothing there. So that's point number one. Point number two, that is particularly important in the context of an armed conflict because, of course, Israel will have military objectives, a number of military objectives, as a matter of fact. And it is really important to understand and to insist that genocide can happen in an armed conflict situation. Because if we were to let some of those interpretations become the norm, it will mean that you will never be able to find genocide is in an armed conflict because there will be other intentions. And that is impossible to conclude that. I mean, everyone, I'm sure, of your listeners will understand that it makes no sense to suggest that in an armed conflict situation there cannot be genocidal intent because there are other intentions. That is just crazy, frankly, and it belies everything that we know about armed conflict. So that is why we are insisting on the fact that war cannot excuse anything, any violation of international law, and war certainly cannot be a justification for genocide.
Why do you think that people, organizations, states have been hesitant in finding genocidal intent?
Well, I think the primary reason is because of the identity of the perpetrator, which is Israel, a country that has been founded in the aftermath of what is probably still now the most deadly genocide ever committed against a protected group. I'm talking about the Holocaust. So I think it is very difficult for everybody, for many people, including ourselves, to think that the victims of such an horrific, historically speaking, crime could then become the perpetrator of a genocide. So that's where, that's in the collective consciousness of some people, I will say, European, European and Western in the first place. I think around the world, people are in no doubt that a perpetrator can become a victim and a victim can become a perpetrator. This is actually the story that history tells us, human civilization tells us. And I think it is important to move beyond those considerations, even if they are there, and to understand that genocide is not a question of belief. It is not a question of opinion even. It is a question of law. It is a matter of collecting legal evidence and looking to demonstrate whether it meets the threshold of genocide. And that is what we've done. So I will invite all your listeners to read our report with an open eyes, not to be triggered by the words and the findings. And I hope and I think they will too conclude that genocide is being committed by the Israeli authorities.
It's one of my final questions, but I guess when you issue such a thorough report, the idea is not just to say, look at what Amnesty's done, look how good we are. The idea is to have recommendations and then push people, states, organizations, UN bodies into actions to stop this genocide. Yeah. So could you tell me, like, briefly, what are the main kind of recommendations of the report?
Yeah, that is fundamental, Frank. Thank you. This is an ongoing genocide. So the first, what is really driving us, driving my colleagues, have been driving all of us who have been working on that report relentlessly, is to put an end to it. That's our first objective. And the first step must be a ceasefire. And I know it has been asked repeatedly. We want to yet again add evidence to the urgent call for a ceasefire. It must be the priority. Now, beyond that immediate needs that is meant to alleviate the suffering, there are many other things that needs to happen. First of all, there are governments around the world that risk being complicit in the crime of genocide because they are selling or providing weapons, because they are shielding Israel from Security Council resolution. I'm speaking here about the United States. These countries need to understand that they are facing the risk of being complicit in the crime of genocide, that they are definitely already violating their obligation, and they must stop. They must stop to do so immediately, because they have emboldened Israel over the last 14 months. So, the second demand. The third one is based on the realization that sadly, genocide has been happening not only because of the complicity of some state, but also because of the inaction of the majority. Yes, we have South Africa that has gone to the International Court of Justice, and that is a very important step. But further than that, states have said the right thing. The vast majority of government have said this is awful, it must stop. They have adopted resolution at the General Assembly of the UN, which are very strong message. But where are the action? And that is where they are failing, the people of Palestine. They need far more resolute action. We are calling on them to create a collective platform, to stop speaking in their individual names, to come together on a collective platform to put an end to the genocide, to demand accountability for the crimes being committed. They must collectively commit to implement the International Criminal Court arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his former Minister of Defense, and, if there is any Hamas leaders left, against them as well. They must come together to commit to arrest anyone on their territories that may be implicated in the crime of genocide. As you know, there are many binationals right now who are members of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. There are many of them that are walking free on the street of European countries and European cities. It is incumbent upon the judicial institution of those countries to conduct investigation into the possibility that some of those individuals are war criminals, are genociders. And if that is the case, they must be arrested and they must be prosecuted. It is a matter under our national jurisdictions of many European countries in particular, but it is also something that is demanded under universal jurisdiction. So, in addition to all that, then there are sanctions. Sanction regime against the Israeli authorities, against indeed those responsible for the illegal settlement. There must be sanctions against a government that has been found guilty of unlawful military occupation. We need far more action, and we need collective action, not a few states on their own doing things. They must create platform, and they must resolutely demand an end to the carnage against the Palestinian people of Gaza.
My last question, Agnes. It's amazing to have such a report out. It will reinforce many around the world, including legal experts and UN agencies. It's great to have recommendations, but what we've been witnessing for the last 14 months now is exactly, and you mentioned that, the opposite, right? The lack of actions, impunity, the lack of accountability, complicity. So are you worried, like many legal experts and aid organizations across the world, that if Israel and its leaders do not face consequences for their criminal actions, the whole international system could actually collapse, and that there could be a before and after the Gaza genocide?
Well, we have, I certainly have said so myself, that the fact that we have been made the witness of that genocide for the last 14 months, committed in complete impunity, is also a reflection of the collapse of the international rule-based system, is a deadly reflection of the double standard of the United States and a number of other countries. And it could indeed signal a new era. The problem with the new era is that there are no alternative rules at the moment. Countries such as Israel, the United States, but also Russia, in its aggression of Ukraine, are destroying the rules without any plan B. There is no alternative system right now. And that is extremely dangerous. And I mean it. It's dangerous. It's actually a matter of existence, existentialist threat for the world. So I agree with you that what we are witnessing is indeed a defining moment, and one that is that shoots and shivers to all of us. There are countries that are intending to use that genocide, possibly, to recreate an international system. But given what's happening, that international system will be driven by two principles: selfish interest and the force of the weapon. There is no normative framework right now that is underpinning whatever vision those leaders have. And that means that whatever is being constructed will be constructed on the back of the most vulnerable people around the world. Now, the only thing I would like to say that is more positive is that countries have not acted a lot, but they have done a few things. It is, I think, formidable to see that many countries in the so-called global south are saying we believe in the international system. We are turning to the International Court of Justice, and we want to uphold the rulings from the International Court of Justice. They are prepared to implement the rulings of the International Criminal Court and to implement the arrest warrant against Netanyahu, including in Europe. A number of European governments have said so. So that's very good. There are positive signs. And then the last final point I want to make is that international justice is slow, Frank. It is very, very slow. We were talking about World War II earlier. Yes, there were the Nuremberg Tribunal immediately after it. But the vast majority of perpetrators, including of the Holocaust, were indicted years, if not decades later, including in our own country, France. And if you look at other terrible crimes that have been committed, massive crimes that have been committed, if you look at the Rwanda genocide, people are still being indicted now, and we are 2024. This crime was committed in 1994. So the wheel of justice is slow, and we need to remember that. This is why we need to look for all kind of alternative. International justice is not delivered quickly.
And yes, many thanks for taking the time to answer my questions and explain sort of the report in more details. This is much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you.